I'd like to call to order the Plan and Zone Commission meeting of today, February 6th. Roll call, please. Oh.
Okay, I know it's been a while. Connell.
Present.
Hepner.
Here.
Ingram.
Present.
Kelling.
Here.
Lammers.
Present.
Manus.
Here.
Martinez. Med.
Here.
Quinn.
Here.
Reinhardt.
Here.
Tallman here. We have a quorum, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Tallman. Tonight, I probably should have mentioned, this is not a public hearing, but in that there's some new information that's being brought forward, we are going to deviate somewhat from our normal rules, and we will allow everybody that wants to speak time to speak. Now, I'm trying to limit that to about 3 minutes a person. If Civil Rights has somebody here that wants to speak on the behalf of Civil Rights, I'll allow them, and I'll allow Palmer 5 minutes apiece. But we feel that there's enough new information available that we needed to reopen this for discussion. First of all, we'll start with report of City Council activity.
Nothing to report.
Thank you. I also want to say, if you have a cell phone, our technology here, if you get a voicemail, it could very well bleed into our recording, so I would highly recommend you turn it off as opposed to just silencing it, unless you don't mind what shows up on city tapes. Secretary's report.
Move report.
Second.
All in favor of the Secretary's report? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It will move forward as written. Report of the Comprehensive Plan Committee. Matt?
Sure, I'll just mention we have been working with our consultant to finalize the first draft of the new zoning ordinance. That should be out and presented to the steering committee within probably the next 2 weeks.
Thank you, Matt.
Following that, there'll be more public dialogue.
Thank you. Now we will move on to zoning activity. Commissioner Tallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one case this evening. That's case number REZ 17-08. Request of Palmer College of Chiropractic to rezone 38.65 acres, more or less, generally located between Harrison Street and Pershing Avenue and between East 12th and 5th Streets from R4 Moderate Density Dwelling District, R6M High Density Dwelling District, C1 Neighborhood Commercial District, C2 General Commercial District, C4 Central Business District, and M1 Light Industrial District, 2 PID Planned Institutional District. Mr. Chairman, I would like to make a motion to remove case REZ 17-05 from the table.
Second.
The motion to remove REZ 17-05 has been taken off the table for discussion. I'd like to take a minute also to state that this is not going to be like our regular public hearing. I'm first going to have staff make their presentation to us. Normally we would be able to ask questions of staff at that time. I'm going to... Oh, sorry. A vote on what?
The motion second.
I thought we did. Oh, okay. Okay, all those in favor of the motion to remove from the table signify by
Aye.
Aye.
opposed. It's off the table. My mistake.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like then to make a motion that we accept staff's recommendation to accept the findings listed and forward case REZ 17-08 to the City Council with recommendation for approval subject to the following 6 conditions.
Second.
Case number REZ 17-08 has been moved and seconded for discussion. I apologize for my error earlier. We are going to change this up a little bit. Normally we would be asking questions throughout the presentation, both regarding staff, the petitioner. Tonight, what I would like to do is have staff give their presentation. I would normally then let the audience speak in opposition or in favor, but tonight there could be several that want to speak. it doesn't matter to me whether you're in favor of it or you're against it. You'll be allowed 3 minutes, more or less, to make your statement. You will simply approach the podium where Ryan is standing. You will identify yourself along with your address and make your statement. We will then let the Civil Rights Commission make a statement. I will allow 5 minutes for that statement, as I will also do for Palmer if they have a representative here. That being said, Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ryan Rusnak with Community Planning Economic Development Department. It's been a while since we've last seen this request, specifically September 5th of 2017. I feel the need to kind of go through the request and kind of refresh everybody about what Palmer is actually requesting. Since the initial request, Palmer has withdrawn the properties that are shown in red. They did not own these properties, and in some form there was some letter of or objection or concern, and so they withdrew these from the request. I'd also like to point out that on September 5th, 2017, at the regular meeting, the Plan and Zoning Commission tabled the request to allow the city sufficient time to hire a consultant to analyze if the approval of the rezoning and ultimate build-out would cause a disparate impact on low-income and minority communities. The analysis was completed in December 2017 and determined in part the City of Davenport's approval of Palmer's PID rezoning application does not create a disparate impact on protected racial or ethnic groups. I would like to say that city staff concurs with that analysis. Here's the zoning and the land use map. There's various zonings throughout. You see residential, commercial, as well as industrial. And the land use map that shows quite a bit that is civic institutional, represents the high school in Palmer, some in the downtown area to the south, and some residential general to the northeast. Wanted to kind of talk about a few things, kind of to give a refresher on the PID itself. The PID, Plan Institutional District, was adopted in 2011, and the Plan Institutional District applies to all major educational and medical campuses. At the time, the ordinance, which still exists, any campus, medical or institutional, educational that was 40 acres or more was compelled to apply for the Plan Institutional District. It's intended to encourage a comprehensive approach to the arrangement of land uses for the campus and mitigate any potential negative impacts to surrounding areas. And this is opposed to a piecemeal development that we did special use permits through the Zoning Board of Adjustment that was really a piecemeal incremental growth, and this is just to take a step back and look at the overall campus growth in a comprehensive approach. Once approved, the land use plan shall remain in effect for a period of 10 years, although minor updates and amendments can be pursued. There is a list of what's considered a minor amendment and a major amendment. Minor amendments are small deviations that can be approved administratively. Major amendments would have to come back before this commission and ultimately City Council for an update of the land use plan. I would like to point out that the proposed zoning contains less than 40 acres, so Palmer wasn't compelled to come forward with this request. I think in part it originated with Palmer's request to demolish 12 historic properties and to remove a protected brick street. And with the Preservation Commission struggled a little bit without knowing ultimately what that area would look like. And so the negotiation that happened with the Historic Preservation Commission was that the Palmer would apply for and ultimately obtain the Plan Institutional District. The Plan Institutional District contains two major elements. These are the two big things that go along with the rezoning. The one is the land use plan, which articulates the arrangement of the land uses and various elements of the property, designating what areas are for development, whether that be green space, dormitories, parking lots. You'll see some proposed road closures, those types of things. And the second is the narrative intent and compatibility with surrounding areas. And this was just a written description to go along with architectural themes, how they intend to blend in with the community, and also how they intend to respond to any potential conflicts that arise because of their development. There's several elements of the land use plan. You can see one here. This one actually identifies which properties were proposed to be demolished. One of those properties, Old St. Luke's Hospital, has already been demolished. That was authorized by the Historic Preservation Commission. This is an area which shows greening of the edges along the campus. It shows a diagram to the left of kind of that campus edge. And this really where you get into the specifics of the design. And so this isn't meant to be a full-blown engineering drawing. This is what we call a more than a concept plan, but less than what we call a full site plan. So there's not full engineering, but it really talks about the arrangement of land uses. And that's kind of the north half of the campus, and here's the south half. And I probably should go there to talk about. So I had to kind of break it down between roadway boundaries because several north-south and east-west there's boundaries. The campus between Brady Street and Main Street, the conversion of an existing parking lot to green space and a practice field. There would be a net reduction of 129 parking spaces. The area between Main Street and Brady Street, formalizing the improvements made to the fitness center, which is now open. Demolition of the St. Luke's Hospital, which has occurred, and houses to the south and in its place, new student housing and underground parking for that student housing, as well as the adjacent properties that Palmer owns to the east. There is, in the land use plan, a data sheet which offers a lot of specifics about heights, densities, and things like that accompany it. The data sheet shows this building to be 50 feet in height. I'm talking about the proposed dormitory on Main Street. That is permissible, but it does show a smaller setback of 0 feet. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Staff's opinion that setback should be a little bit larger. Shows vacating and closing a portion of West 7th Street and West 8th Street to allow what we call an enhanced campus corridor. And that's that area really to allow pedestrians or students to kind of be able to walk to the north-south. I don't think the physical character of the road would change, but it would at least be proposed to be blocked at this time. The campus between Brady Street and Perry Street, new mixed-use building south of the current gas station. And again, there's a 0-foot setback proposed, but that's pretty dominant along that Brady Street corridor. Demolition of 4 buildings and the expansion of surface parking lots south of East 12th and west of Perry. This would allow a net increase of 138 parking spaces. Vacating, closing a portion of Palmer Drive between Perry and the alley to the west. The campus between Perry and Pershing Street, vacating and removing East 11th Street. This is the protected brick street, which I mentioned. Let's see, they would allow that area to be a passive green space, so there'd be a net decrease of 38 parking spaces. Vacating and closing of East 9th Street and East 10th Street between Perry Street and Pershing Street and the alley in between to allow construction of new 454 parking spaces. And that's better shown here. So these are the areas, the roads and alleys that would be proposed to be vacated. I would mention that the city traffic engineer, Gary Stotts, is here. We looked at this from a technical aspect. Mr. Stotts didn't object to the potential vacating of this. I would note that Palmer must come back and request that formally for the vacation for the city council, and this Plan and Zoning Commission would consider that. The major elements of the narrative of intent and compatibility. I don't want to read all of these, but this just talks about how it's interaction of the campus and the surrounding area. And again, a major change to this would require the land use plan to come back to you and the city council. Public input. Notices were sent for property owners. within 500 feet of the request, notifying of them of the August 1st, 2017 Plan and Zoning Commission. Previous to that, the applicant held a stakeholder meeting on April 13th, 2017, and a neighborhood meeting on April 20th. Approximately 10 stakeholders attended the stakeholder meeting, and the approximately 50 people attended the surrounding property owner meeting. I thought it was pretty well attended. Since the request was tabled indefinitely, notices were sent again to property owners within 500 feet of the request, notifying of this meeting. To date, staff has received 6 letters in favor of the request and 2 letters in opposition of the request. One letter in opposition was concerned about the level of houses being demolished and that they should be rehabbed and restored. The other objection was from a property owner that was within the Palmer request, but Palmer is proposing to, in the future, acquire that land and make it into a parking lot. It seemed like there was a bit of a civil dispute, meaning that the Palmer parking lot was a bit higher than that land and there were some drainage issues. And then we did receive 1 letter and 1 draft notes questioning the methodology used in the disparate impact analysis. I would like to make one point. Palmer doesn't have the power of eminent domain. There are a couple properties in the land use plan and proposed in the rezoning that they do not own. They need a willing seller in order to acquire that property and ultimately develop that property in accordance with the land use plan. Staff recognizes that there's potential for some properties, not many. There were very few. There was one at the north end of the campus that was strictly a retail use, and then there's some apartments that are strictly residential uses. The ordinance talks about dormitories, but not. It's a little bit of a gray area. So one of the conditions that we're putting in there is that that there really be no requirement to convert a non-conforming use if made non-conforming by this rezoning if it's been vacant for a year, and I'll talk about that in our findings and recommendations. Proposed findings. The adoption of the land use plan enables the community to understand and visualize the levels of development being proposed, their impacts, and appropriate mitigation. Proposed rezoning would articulate the limits of institutional growth and mitigate potential and adverse impacts associated with development and expansion. The rezoning would facilitate the ability of Palmer College to grow and adapt to the changing needs of their students while protecting the livability and vitality of adjacent neighborhoods. And lastly, the design of the campus mitigates any potential impacts to the surrounding neighborhood. Staff does recommend approval of REZ 1708. We ask that you forward it to City Council with a recommendation for approval. We believe that the request achieves consistency with the PID ordinance. Number 1, and this is the one I mentioned, that any property rendered nonconforming by the adoption of the planned institutional district not be subject to section 1746020 entitled discontinuance conformance required. That's kind of that grandfather clause where if something becomes vacant for a year, it's got to come into conformance. Number 2, that buildings achieve consistency with the required 25-foot setback. If an ordinance amendment is not brought forward, I could tell you I wrote this ordinance. The 25-foot setback in my mind was really to apply to the perimeter of the campus where you're creating a campus edge. The Palmer's campus is bifurcated by several major roads, some of which the character is right on the street. Some of it's a bit further back. And so there may be a possibility for basically some setback reductions if warranted. Number 3, that the land use plan be amended to depict the 25-foot setback for the buildings along Main Street. As I mentioned, I think the character along Main Street, considering we have a kind of an institutional corridor through there, be that the high school, the churches, we feel that there is a little bit more of a setback along that area, and a 0-foot setback I think would be too intense for that, what we call that educational corridor. There were a few things that staff believes that needs to be cleaned up on the land use plan. What we need is for the land use plan to clearly articulate the existing, and I put in parentheses those to be preserved. Palmer made commitments throughout this process, although it was demolishing certain historic buildings, that it would preserve certain historic buildings, and staff would like to see that clearly articulated on the land use plan. Also, some stated densities in the past didn't quite make it to the plan, and we just want to make sure that clearly that land use plan articulates the Palmer's intent moving forward. And lastly, that Palmer request the formal vacation abandonment of public streets and alleys, and that these areas on the land use plan are only descriptive in error, and then a future use of the property does not compel approval of that vacation. That, in essence, that is its own process. That's all I have, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Would anybody at this time from the audience like to come forward and speak? If so, approach the podium.
Thank you, Mr. Ingram. Thank you, Plan and Zoning Commission. My name is Scott Tunnicliffe. I'm the Executive Director of the Hilltop Campus Village. That's a not-for-profit organization that's engaged in preservation, rehabilitation, redevelopment, and revitalization of our city. I rise in support of this plan because it can serve as a template as we go forward with the very important business in the city of Davenport of urban core redevelopment. It's critical to our future, and we believe that the neighbors and the associations in the historic districts will benefit by having something on the table like this, and that the Hilltop Campus Village will benefit because we'll be able to point to this Palmer College as a vital amenity to attract business, to attract investment from commercial and real estate industry interests. If we go forward with this, I think the larger issues that run throughout the urban core can be addressed as one block, running it all the way from, say, Bridge to Division, and from 6th to call it 14th, if you like, whatever the opportunity zone is determined to be. But we need to address that as a large entity, and we should not be doing anything except thanking the Palmer people and putting forward the plan, as Mr. Rusnak said, to allow them to expand in such a manner that they can be a partner and grow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is AJ Reed, and I think the only real investment that needs to be considered are the community residents of Davenport, and I don't think that they have a real say on what's going on with Palmer, and I think that's something that really needs to be addressed. Residents create our communities, and if they have no say in the process with Palmer, with this committee, with the city council, then why are we living in our towns? So I really think that Palmer needs to put this on pause, talk to the community residents that are being affected so that something could work for everybody, not just for one institution.
Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Carrie Clark, and I am a concerned citizen and local attorney. I understand the position of what I believe the previous speaker called the Hilltop Campus Village, but there are more important things than money in our communities. The analysis that was presented does not account for the non-student population that's going to be displaced by this PID. It does not account for the affected residents, which is the whole point of the analysis, but it misrepresents the data and misuses the data. An independent expert from the Public Interest Legal Advocates Housing Justice Center states that the data that's used in that analysis is not sufficient to present a reliable conclusion. Palmer acknowledges that they need to mitigate potential impacts, but they don't say exactly how, and they acknowledge that there's going to be a negative impact on this community. If Palmer didn't have to request approval, why are they here doing so? There has to be some benefit to them. The notices were sent to property owners. I've heard no word of what has been told to the residents and whether the residents have received notice that they can come and speak on this issue. The ordinance that provides for planned institutional districts has a second part. It provides that that protected classes cannot be discriminated against. So that language is similar to equal protection languages. So by approving this PID, you might be raising an equal protection issue under the state constitution and under the United States Constitution. The Mosaic study is based on faulty data, and the analysis of the Housing Justice Center, as far as I know, has not been considered by this commission. The bottom line is that this plan perpetuates gentrification, that targets communities of color, and the Fair Housing Act prohibits this kind of rezoning because it creates a disparate impact on the residents of color. The census data shows that the districts covered by this PID, it's essentially a four corners area of four different census data districts. It's between 45 and 55% black residents. We cannot ignore that this is a growing trend across the country, and I urge you to vote against forwarding this to the City Council. Thank you.
Thank you. Next. Would anybody else like to speak?
Hello, my name's Wes Furneaux. I live here in Davenport. I work for a nonprofit that works with folks that don't have a house, but I'm here as a concerned citizen. I think there's already a housing shortage in Davenport, so I think if...
Excuse me, we need your full name and address.
Wes Furneaux, 400 Main Street.
I didn't hear the for now. My mistake.
No worries. So I think if there's going to be a reduction in housing that's affordable for Davenport residents, I think there needs to be something that increases that somewhere. Thanks.
Thank you.
My name is John Dutay. I live at 1110 East High Street in Davenport. And I'd like to just recommend that you all postpone this vote tonight. Read an article called When Universities Swallow Cities that talks about the trend of universities, medical centers taking over neighborhoods, displacing folks all over the country. And we can see that happening here with this plan. In my neighborhood, where Genesis has accumulated 36 acres of land, it has not triggered a PID yet, and we all know what's going on at St. Ambrose. Scott and I usually agree on everything, but one point of disagreement that we do have maybe is that this will become a template, and this cannot be the template for rebuilding our inner city. We cannot turn over our inner city neighborhoods to private entities without something like a pilot program, a payment in lieu of taxes, or some compensation back to the city by these private entities. These private entities should not rely on all of our public services and at the same time displace our residents. Finally, someone would have to be blind or just not aware of Davenport's history to say that this does not have a disparate impact on this neighborhood. We all know it does. We're not counting the hundreds, if not thousands, of families and kids that over the last 10 or 15 years have been displaced from this neighborhood. So I really encourage you to take a step back, look at the big picture of what's happening in so many of our neighborhoods of Davenport. Look at what the city council is doing with trying to spend money to revitalize our inner city with families, not just students. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Olivia Williams. I live at 631 East 15th Street in Davenport. I'm an affordable housing scholar and professor at Augustana, and having just moved here, I see Davenport's growing a lot. Downtown, there's a lot of revitalization going on, and this project really concerns me. I've seen it play out in other places, and like the last person said, this is a pattern across the United States where universities work, get city help in a lot of cases, and work with planning groups like Mosaic. Mosaic has actually done a very similar plan in Tallahassee, Florida, where I just moved from. And years after, this redevelopment has happened in Tallahassee, a lot of businesses have gone out of business. Local businesses have been displaced. Rents are going up. Affordable housing has also gone away in this area. And people of color and low-income renters are getting pushed further and further from the city center. And I see that happening here. I see a lot of displacement already happening downtown and in the West End. People are talking about development going on down there. And it really concerns me that there's not an effort to compensate, at least for renters, or at least get their opinions in these plans, and to get funding if this redevelopment's happening, also get funding for affordable housing for people whose housing is getting torn down, or their rents might go up in this area after this happens. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Good evening. My name is Dennis Marchiori. I'm the Chancellor and CEO of Palmer College, and thank you for allowing me to say a couple of words. Especially, I'd like to commend the city staff on the thoroughness of the PID process. When we started the process, I really wasn't sure what it entailed. We wanted a very limited scope of changes on our campus as far as the campus plan went, and the PID process seemed a bit larger than our current needs for the request for demolition of some properties that we owned and were vacant. However, as we got into the PID process, and certainly listening to some of the comments this evening, I realized how important it is that we do have a thorough process, and I certainly endorse the PID to the point that it has done that. At every turn, the city's planning staff have demonstrated a commitment to an objective process, one that we can all be very proud of, open communication, including what we're seeing this evening, and professionalism. And the Palmer community is certainly excited about our planned changes and our improvements. We think these improvements are going to be embraced by everyone. That is, our employees, our students, and our neighbors. We think everybody will get excited about that. And our $50 million investment in our 120-year-old main campus is something that's significant to the Palmer system, with our 3 campuses. This main campus is our Fountainhead campus and extremely significant to us. So the students that live around our campus, we certainly want to have a great environment for them, and we also want to have a very good environment for the neighbors that surround our campuses. I enjoyed the community meetings that Ryan pointed to that were part of the PID process and engaging with our neighbors, and we know we have their full support, so we're looking forward to continuing this PID process and a positive vote from the Commission. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to speak at this time?
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Latrice Lacey. I'm the Director of the Civil Rights Commission. So our commission is going to discuss this issue next week at our meeting. We were unaware that it was being pulled from the table to discuss because we haven't had any internal discussions based on it. So after they discuss it, I will have, I'm sure, more to say, but I did want to come here tonight to kind of give our input and our stance and why we requested that there be a disparate impact analysis. But I also kind of want to talk about, this has brought up a lot of good issues for us in that there seems to be a need for some procedural changes One of which is when we are rezoning such a large area, especially this area, which is heavily populated by renters, which we can see from data provided by city staff. Renters should have some sort of notice that they could be being displaced by changes in the zoning process. So what we have is we are sending notices to property owners. Obviously, they have a property right. Renters also have a right to their living arrangements, and they aren't getting any sort of notice that they can come here to speak to you all and tell you what their opinions are about this PID process. Additionally, the agenda that went out tonight, it doesn't say that there's going to be an opportunity for anyone to speak. So there may have been more people who wanted to come out to speak, but they chose not to because they didn't think that there would be an opportunity to come and speak on anything that's on the agenda, because it specifically says that you can't speak about anything that's on the agenda. Another issue, I think, for anyone to say that they agree with the mosaic analysis, that it causes concern. The mosaic analysis is very clearly poorly written. It is comparing apples to oranges. I read through it. I had no idea what I was reading. On one page, we were comparing renters. One page, we were comparing the number of families that were there. On the next page, we were comparing the number of people. So we had 3 different populations of people who were being compared in one study. So we never knew what we were reading on which page we were reading at. So what we did was we consulted with experts who work in this field. I, as someone who works in fair housing, I've worked in fair housing for years, I don't know how to do a disparate impact analysis to this level without going out door to door, seeing who lives in each unit and what the rent is. We don't know. So we don't have the appropriate staffing levels or funding to do this kind of study, which is why it was farmed out. What Mosaic did shows that they maybe didn't have the level of expertise necessary to do this kind of study either. So Calvin Bradford, who actually wrote the law review article that's cited in the Mosaic study, he gave input. That's the six-page document that I assume you all received via email today. And he's basically saying the same thing that I was saying. He doesn't understand what he was reading. It's comparing different groups of people. There's no way for him to give a real analysis of who's being impacted because we don't know who's being impacted because the data isn't there. So that's another concern that we would have, that we can't trust the conclusions that are reached by this study because we don't know what data they're using. We can't compare the number of students who are there within this area because students are not being negatively impacted. Palmer is rezoning this area to build more student housing. They're going to get a benefit regardless because we're building more student housing. We're not building housing for the residents that are currently there. Considering the historical nature of this area specifically, which was an area that has been redlined and relegated several members of our minority communities to that area, we know that there's going to be a disparate impact on minorities in that area because that was the only place that they were allowed to live historically, which is why we still have such a high minority population south of Locust, because that was the area that they were redlined to. So we know that any sort of changes in that area that would displace people is going to disproportionately impact minorities. So I think just on its face, we can say that it's probably going to have a disparate impact. But the input that we got from Mr. Can and Mr. Bradford kind of reiterate that and show us that, yes, indeed, there will be a disparate impact on those communities. Again, when we're looking at the study by Mosaic, on one page they say that I think they said there's about 40 units of privately owned student housing. Either it's a typo or they don't understand that. I mean, that is not possible to be privately owned student housing. That would be violative of the Fair Housing Act. So it looks like they didn't count those units. Units that have been made vacant by the person requesting the rezoning. Those units need to be included because but for the actions of that owner, those units would be available for people to move into. So though we live in this society and we say, if someone is able to buy a property, they should be able to do whatever they want with their property. If it has such a huge disparate impact on protected classes, then there is an avenue there for there to be intervention by fair housing advocates, by people who are impacted, and they can come forward and bring a claim under the Fair Housing Act, which is why the commission wanted to intervene prior to there being some sort of injury to the residents of that area and causing any sort of legal action, so that there could be conversation and all of the parties could work together and try to develop a solution that would be equitable and fair to everyone, not just the people who are in positions to afford to do kind of whatever they want. We know based on our demographics that the vast majority of our renters here in the city of Davenport are African American. Probably about 80% of our renters are African American. Also, African Americans are disproportionately represented in our lower income job classifications. So we have a shortage of affordable housing already within the city of Davenport. This is where our affordable housing is. This is where a lot of our Section 8 vouchers are using Section 8. If we eliminate more housing, where are those people going to go? We're not making more housing, and if we eliminate more housing, there's going to be more people who are being displaced, causing an additional strain on the resources that we have. So, thank you.
Staff, point of clarification. I don't care, Ryan or Brian. Did we not make it abundantly clear to civil rights that people would be able to speak tonight? I know I was involved in 2 or 3 meetings. And while we don't normally do that at a regular meeting, I thought from the get-go we made that clear that that was going to be available.
I do note on the notice that was written, it specifically said that citizens, although in a limited role, meaning time-wise, would have the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to speak at this time? Seeing, okay.
I'm confused by what you mean there. The agenda that I just got from the box outside the door says, time open for citizens wishing to address the commission on matters not on the established agenda.
Right.
Was there another communication about that?
Isn't that the forum for open comment?
Yeah, that's at the end of our meeting for open comment.
Right, but Ms. Lacey's point was that it says to address the commission on matters not on the agenda.
But again, that's not part of this petition. After we're done with all of our business,
I see.
we open it up to anybody that wants to bring something to us that is not part of our agenda.
I understand. Thank you.
I'd like to clarify, I was not told that there would be an opportunity for the public to make a comment. And when I asked the last time, because I was going to speak about this when it was on your agenda before, I was told that there is no opportunity to speak about things that are on the regular meeting agenda. You can only come up and speak when it's on the public hearing agenda.
That is correct, and we made an exception to that.
I was not told.
Well, I have to defer to staff. Would anybody else like to speak? It appears as though Palmer has spoken, as has Civil Rights. Commissioners, do you have any questions at this time? I open it up to you. Commissioner Reinhardt.
Thank you, sir. I've got 3 questions, and I'm not sure who can answer them. Part of it's probably due to, can be answered by Palmer, and the balance can probably be answered by staff. Question 1 is how much of the vacant land will be available for private development in the future? As Palmer moves forward, or if you move forward, how much of the vacant land that's going to be within the PID will be available for private development if someone wants to come in and develop an area for low-income housing? Will there be any land available?
Well, it's going to be privately owned. It would be at Palmer's discretion. However, I would note that this land use plan articulates what development would occur. And so if the land use plan doesn't show an area for development of to your example, low-income housing, staff would have to object to that proposal because it's not clearly articulated on the land use plan.
Okay, so there hasn't been, in the land use plan, then there's no allotment for that then?
Correct.
Okay, the other question I had, that answers number 2. The other question I had is, has anybody thought about the impact that is going to be created when students that are currently renting in some of these homes or other structures leave those structures to go to Palmer, their new dormitory setups? Obviously, those properties are going to be vacated and made available to the general population. Has that been taken into consideration for the evaluation of the losses associated of low-income housing? I mean, if we're going to put 35 or 40 people in a new structure that Palmer builds for students, it would stand to reason that those students would be vacating one of the properties that's currently in use by Palmer or private ownership.
I would agree with that statement. I mean, it may provide for an opportunity of more housing units that are for affordable housing. Yeah, the analysis didn't occur to what the Palmer renter analysis was on the outside of the campus, so that's pretty difficult to.
Okay, I'm just trying to get a feel for, are we totally losing low-income rental properties, or does the potential exist for a movement in one segment of people to the Palmer housing and another segment of people able to fill the properties that aren't demolished?
The city staff's position, and will come, this will be probably reoccurring, is that a professional analysis was performed and it shows that the rezoning would cause no disparate impact.
Okay, thank you very much.
Commissioner Kelling.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I don't know who is best to answer this, but perhaps the Chancellor. What is the condition of these properties today that are going to be raised? Are they vacant, number one? Are they, even if they are vacant, are they habitable through some minor or not tremendous cost rehabilitation? And if so, what do you project to be the cost of that rehabilitation? In other words, are these houses right now so deplorable that they have to be torn down, that nobody could live in them, even with a minor fix? Or are they something that can be preserved in due course? Does the city of Davenport know that?
I'll go ahead and chime in. I've been in, particularly in the northeast quadrant, I've been in most, if not all, those structures. I would generally classify them as in need of major rehabilitation. Are they structurally unsound? No, but they would be a costly endeavor to go in and bring those to a 21st century habitable form.
Okay, if they are torn down and Palmer then creates new housing for students, are any of those new units going to be made available to non-students? And if so, would they be charged market rent or below market rent or subsidized rents of any kind? What do we know about the future housing to be created?
The PID that we submitted speaks to housing only because the scope of the PID was so extensive into the future. Palmer does have a plan to examine housing, and we have consultants working on that question, but we have no immediate plans to build student housing. I'm not saying that we won't be back with a project, but we have no immediate project for that. The immediate project that we have is the athletic field. So to your point, if we did move into student housing, for the most part, Palmer is not in a housing business, and we would, if we had vacancy, we would likely rent to a long list of employees and faculty and folks in our Palmer community. I wouldn't say that we wouldn't have other opportunities for community, but that wouldn't be part of our mission or our plan at all. So right now, it's hard for us to specifically answer your question because we don't have housing plan to erect and knowing capacity and so forth.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you. I didn't know that. I thought maybe somewhere in this $50 million improvement there might be a plan for new housing for Palmer students.
I'm Tom Tiemeyer. I work for Palmer College as well. I'm the CFO, acting CFO. Part of the issue that we have to deal with in regards to providing non-student housing is our tax-exempt status. And when we start getting into renting to non-Palmer students, then the whole issue of our property tax exemptions come to the forefront. So there's a fine line that we have to draw in regards to all our housing in regards to that.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to clarify a couple of things.
Please do.
There is on the land use plan a proposal for student housing on Main Street. I think what the chancellor is referring to is in their immediate plans. They don't see a need to construct that because obviously, as any institution, there's required to be some fundraising in order to develop that portion of the land use plan. But there is a substantial, I believe it's 100-unit student housing, at least shown on the land use plan. And keep in mind that's a 10-year plan. The housing that Mr. Flynn referred to on the north end was not included in the disparate impact analysis because those housing units are already vacant. There are several housing units throughout the Palmer PID that are in fine shape and being rented to students and non-students that are, like I said, are in fine shape. That Palmer owns some of them, and there's several that Palmer do not own. And I just would reiterate that those property owners are not compelled to sell to Palmer in order for them to demolish and build a parking lot. It takes a willing seller and a willing buyer seeing if they could come together on what the value of that property is. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Commissioners, any additional questions? Commissioner Lammers.
Having received these reports just this morning, what is the city's position on the question of the data used, primarily students versus residents, and what weight should we be having in our minds when we consider this information?
It's the city's position that we hired a professional. Again, with the disparate impact analysis, we as city staff are not professionals in this field. The city hired a consultant through the bidding process. We feel that process was adequately done and that there was a finding of no disparate impact, and city staff agrees with the analysis that Mosaic planning consultants put forward.
Secondly, don't we typically address stormwater issues in the conditions of a zoning request? And on one of the reports, the stormwater management may be challenging when portions of the campus are redeveloped, as there is limited storm, sewer, and restructure in the area. Shouldn't that be addressed in the conditions?
That's a good question. I think a lot of times as city staff, we try and be redundant with respect to city ordinances that are already in place. I chose not to do that. There are ordinances that compel certain property owners when they do development to provide for the treatment of stormwater, but those are city ordinances and those are required anyway. I did provide in the analysis that there is limited stormwater infrastructure and that could be a challenge. But that's an engineering challenge that'll have to be sorted out administratively. So I didn't want to create an ordinance condition that said Palmer College of Chiropractic shall comply with city ordinances that they're already required to comply with. Does that make sense? And I didn't want to go as far to say that they're waived from any requirement that you don't have the power to waive.
I only ask because of previous issues that are still unresolved. What's the best way to proceed in terms of ensuring that it's taken care of here while we're considering this?
I think as each development comes forth, and again, it requires funding on the part of Palmer, we'll see a development proposal. We'll work with their team and city staff for an agreeable solution that meets city ordinances. Again, these development proposals, although you see a large development, a scale development, these developments will likely come in one small portion at a time.
And then lastly, has there been any discussions of creative solutions for incenting developers or Palmer or anyone to look at the areas that are the area in question, and if there's going to be impact, that there are some solutions that haven't been considered yet in terms of any incentive to have developers look at the area and develop more affordable housing instead of moving to the outskirts of the city, looking at the central city and even outside of this area, just across the central city, that may help address the concerns here today.
We've had those discussions with Palmer, and they're very supportive of the city's role in incenting development in this area because it's certainly in their best interest. But what we also did talk about is we as city staff wanted to be very careful about not compelling Palmer College to do something that's not in their mission, right? They have a mission as an educational facility, and as city staff, we need to be very careful about compelling Palmer to do something that is really outside of what they do. In my discussions, they've been extremely supportive of city's endeavors to really enhance the areas surrounding their campus.
Thank you.
Commissioner Kelling.
Thank you. Could I ask City Council to come to the podium for a second? Mr. Howard, one of the things I find most confounding about the controversy here, the difference between the Mosaic study and the letter that we received this morning from Attorney McCann, is how there can be such a disparity between interpretations of Supreme Court rulings. That I'm not a legal mind by any means, and I dread reading any Supreme Court opinion. But it seems to me that the court spoke pretty clearly in what a rendition of that we have had access to in the Mosaic report. And now it's being forcefully contradicted by Mr. McCann from the Housing Justice Center. To me, it goes to the heart of what we're trying to figure out here, is how to read these things. And I'm just wondering if you can help us as commissioners or me understand how there can be such a different interpretation. The Inclusive Study Communities Project decision said that there had to be a clear statistical disparity in order to have a discriminatory effect. And the Mosaic study says, no, there isn't one, and now we're having another opinion saying there is one. Which is it? How do we figure this out?
God bless statistical arguments, right? I mean, that's really what it comes down to is you can use statistics to make an argument any way you want to. But statistical disparity is just one consideration that the Supreme Court put forward in the Inclusive Communities decision. So keep in mind that that decision was a 5-4 decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, meaning 4 justices saw it the other way. That's as narrow of a margin as you can have. And I think we would all agree that all 9 justices of the U.S. Supreme Court are probably pretty smart and logical when it comes to legal reasoning and conclusions. So they couldn't even decide to a clear majority. So that gets to your statistical argument. But statistics in this is just one element of a disparate impact study and conclusion. I mean, there are a lot of other hoops that have to be jumped through in order to reach the conclusion that what's before the commission today would actually result in a disparate impact. One is the policy itself has to be the cause of that impact, and I haven't heard anybody address that issue to you tonight. Another is the Supreme Court warned that we get into these statistical arguments because you can get into that argument in any case, and that we can't allow those types of arguments to derail organized and thoughtful government decisions. And so a government decision cannot be derailed based on a pure statistical analysis. It has to be more, is one of the arguments the Supreme Court said. So in this case, we have a professional study, as Ryan said, by Mosaic that says this does not result in a disparate impact. I've reviewed that. I've reviewed the comments. I've reviewed case law. I think that's based on, the Mosaic study is based on reasonable statistical analysis, not that other people can't disagree with it, and that the Mosaic application of those statistics to the law is on sound ground. So given those two things, the issue before the commission tonight is whether or not Palmer's PID application makes sense from a pure zoning perspective, in my opinion, which means you have to consider whether or not, based on zoning reasons, this is a good thing or a bad thing, and that's what you should put your decision on, and make your decision on and cast your vote on. I don't know if that answers your question or helps shed light on it.
Yeah, yes, it does. I guess I'll rest at that. Some of the discussion in these secondary reports talks about the population of the PID area. I mean, whether it's student or non-student, minority or non-minority, it's all people within this district. And to take a different approach, statistical approach to analyzing it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I mean, again, not the Mosaic approach, but this differing opinion today. It's really difficult to follow as to what has been included or not included. I mean, that the non-student population was considered in the Mosaic report, wasn't it?
I believe it was, yes.
So how much weight do we put on this secondary report saying that it wasn't?
Well, I think that's the danger that the Supreme Court warned us about in issuing their decision in inclusive communities, is people can say what they want to with statistics depending on how they have cultivated those statistics. Is the Mosaic statistical analysis perfect? I don't believe it's probably perfect. I don't believe it's imperfect. I don't believe the criticisms that the other two gentlemen have provided are perfect, nor are they imperfect. What we're telling you is the Mosaic study was done professionally. I think it's based on reasonable statistical analysis, which is one factor that goes into examination of a disparate impact claim. There are others that nobody's addressed yet that weigh in favor of the Palmer application, in my legal opinion. And so it really comes down to whether or not this is, my advice to you is make your decision on whether or not this is sound zoning, and why we have the PID ordinance, which is to present a 10-year view of what an institution intends to do with their campus or their land, so that we get it, and the community gets it in an upfront chance to analyze it, instead of over the course of 10 years having piecemeal things brought to the commission or the council for special use permits. So it's not coming in piecemeal. We're getting a 10-year snapshot now. And so I think you need to analyze it on pure zoning grounds.
Thank you.
Commissioner Manus.
Just to clarify, and I appreciate the comments of staff on this, but just so I understand this study, there is a list of proposed property demolitions and construction in this report, and it lists 10 buildings with a total of 75 units. I'm assuming those are the structures that went into the analysis, and then 100 units are proposed in the new housing at Main and 7th. Is that accurate? Am I reading that? So
Yes.
So these 10 buildings, not the ones to the northeast that are not occupied at this point.
That's correct.
Okay, and no other buildings within this area were assumed to be demolished, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And does Palmer own all 10 of these buildings, or no?
They do not.
They do not, okay. Staff made some reference to some historic properties within the PID that Palmer had indicated they would preserve, but I do not believe those have been identified by address. Are those going to be identified by address so that we know what those are?
There are 2 on Brady that staff is seeking. These are the ones that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I don't know that I have that by address, but there were 2 properties on Brady that were on the National Register of Historic Places. And staff also saw fit to retain the former gas station on Main Street. In their proposal, it had shown that as being kind of a ticket station, and that was one of the structures that were being preserved. I would point out that it didn't explicitly call those out to be demolished, nor the ones on Brady Street. However, there was some language in the land use plan that said if it's not specifically called out, it could go to green space. And so what we're asking as part of our recommendation is to clearly articulate that those types of buildings would be preserved.
So the 2 on Main Street and the gas station?
There's 1 on Main Street and there's 2 on Brady.
Okay.
Actually, if you bear with me 1 second, I can probably find that address. Here we go. Land use plan, 732 Brady Street, that's Argyle Flats. 1117 Perry Street, I apologize, there's 1 on Perry, 8 Gables. Those are the 2 listed on the National Register of Historic Places. We would want the land use plan to clearly reflect that those would be preserved. And the former gas station is located at 748 Main Street.
So is that an amendment to the staff recommendation, or would you suggest if the commission wanted to include that we add that?
I would be happy to modify the staff's recommendation to include those addresses so they're clearly articulated. I'd like to also maybe expand that, buildings that may not be on the National Register that they intend to preserve, that if it's their true intent to retain those buildings, that they should articulate that on the land use plan.
And of these 10 buildings to be destroyed, staff had recommended that if they are not owned by Palmer, that their use could continue even if it were abandoned for a period of time. Is that right?
That's correct. In the non-conforming section of the ordinance, if a use is discontinued for a period of 1 year, it's supposed to be brought into conformance with the current zoning. We felt that would be unfair, particularly if some building became vacant and Palmer did not acquire those properties. And so essentially through this, because the rezoning is an ordinance, it would essentially remove that portion of the non-conforming section of the code.
Thank you.
Any other discussion, Commissioners? Commissioner Med.
Thank you. Real quick question. I think I know the answer, but I've seen some things in the media. I don't read everything, but I want to make sure the independent Mosaic study was commissioned by, paid for by the city of Davenport. They went out with requests for quotes and selected Mosaic, not Palmer. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any additional questions? Seeing none, roll call, please.
Connell,
Yes.
Hepner,
Yes.
Kelling,
Yes.
Lammers,
Yes.
Manus,
Yes.
Med,
Yes.
Quinn,
Yes.
Reinhardt.
Yes.
Tallman, yes. The motion carries, and that concludes the report, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Tallman. Appears as though we have no subdivision activity tonight. We have 4 future business cases for you to review before our next meeting on February 20th. At this time, if there are... I'm getting to that. At this time, if there's any other communication from anybody in the audience for something not on our agenda, please step forward. Seeing none, we'll move on to other business. Appears as though, Matt, we've got 2 items.
I'll just mention the fourth quarter report and the annual report are presented. Wayne has a tradition of preparing those. He is not able to be here today, and again, as I believe we did last time, if you'd like a report from Wayne when he's at the next meeting, I will make sure that that's done.
I appreciate that. Any other discussion, commissioners? Seeing none?
Move to adjourn.
All in favor signify by aye. Opposed? We are adjourned. Oh, it's good. Totally good. I screwed it up earlier.